Let us start this second episode with an unequivocal admission from an internationally acclaimed authority on Mappilas and the Mappila Uprising.
Professor Day is an emeritus professor at the Department of History at the Ohio State University. He researched on the Mappila Muslims of Malabar in the 1970s. His book, Islamic Society on the South Asian Frontier, The Mappilas of Malabar, is a well-structured and clearly argued history of Mappilas spanning several centuries. Let me start by asking you about the different narratives about the Malabar Rebellion. Broadly, we have two different perspectives on the rebellion. First one is the colonial and Hindu right-wing perspective, and the second one is the nationalist and Marxist perspective. Colonial and right-wing narratives consider the rebellion as attacks carried out by Muslim fanatics against Hindu land. The nationalist and Marxist narrative portray the Malabar Rebellion as a fight against imperialism. So what do you think about these narratives? Which one do you subscribe to?
Once the British had established fairly firm control in Malabar district, when the Mappilas took action or when they challenged or even attacked members of the Janmi class, who were usually Nambudris or Nayars, they knew that they would be captured. When the Mappilas attacked or even murdered a Janmi, they knew that they would be captured and probably executed.
Yeah.
Certainly imprisoned and probably executed, I think. And so I think for many of them, the alternative was to die as a martyr, that is, to die as a respectable man within the context of the Islamic community.
Professor, there are some attempts to portray these Mappila suicides as jihad or holy war. How do you view such readings?
That's really a mistake, and I think, I suppose you could say that with V.K. Haji and his interest in establishing a Muslim state, you might possibly interpret it that way. But the Mappila Rebellion did not really have the characteristic of it. In my mind, it did not have really the characteristic of a jihad. There was not really an attempt, for example, to forcibly to convert members of the Hindu community. Yeah. I think there may have been one or two cases, but there was no kind of central direction, not conducted like the kind of jihad that you hear about maybe now, or you heard about in earlier history, I think, because you simply don't see that kind of religious enthusiasm for converting the non-Muslims, whether they were Hindus or Christians. And you can see that in other situations, in other countries and so forth, but not in this case, I think, at all, really. And again, going back to what happened in the outbreak of the rebellion, the attacks were directed at government facilities, at British troops, and British officers and government facilities. But they weren't, as far as I know, there weren't any attacks directed at, particularly at Christians, individual Christians. Although there may have been a small number in that area. And as I say, I don't believe there was any systematic attempt to forcibly convert the members of the Hindu community. So in that sense, I think you can't really view it as a jihad. But I don't think that the Mappila Rebellion continued because the Mappilas were angry at the Hindus. I don't think that's the case at all, really. Okay. No doubt there's this tension between poor Mappila tenants and the Janmi class. I mean, there was that tension existed, but just thinking about it now, talking with you, it seems to me that you couldn't interpret what had happened as an outbreak which was directed against the Hindus because they didn't support this protest. I think that's not true at all, really.
Okay.
I mean, I can't think of anything that really would really support that idea.
Okay, cool.
In the previous episode, we cited the arguments put forth by the Muslim members of the Central Legislative Assembly, decrying the accusations leveled against the Mappilas by Hindu members of the Assembly and the Home Minister himself. These Muslim members had argued forcibly and convincingly that the Malabar Uprising was not anti-Hindu and that the Mopular soldiers only acted against those who supported the British, even if the collaborators were from their own fraternity. We now present some of the arguments put forth by Muslim members of the Central Legislature demanding an impartial inquiry into the riots that took place from August 1921 to February 1922. However, the equivocation of the Home Minister, despite the explicit demand for an inquiry by Muslim members, leads one to suspect that the government had much to hide. What follows are some extracts from the proceedings of the Central Legislative Assembly of 9th March 1922. Raja Mirza Muhammad Ikramullah Khan. There have been many questions asked in and outside the assembly as to the causes of the outbreak, but there is no definite statement or pronouncement by competent authority as to the causes of the outbreak. The loss of so many lives and the imprisonment of some thousands of human beings is a matter of concern to humanity in general and to all of us here, for Mopulars are, after all, our fellow subjects. All I ask by this resolution is to find out by a fair and impartial inquiry the causes that led to this outbreak. The Honourable Sir William Vincent, Home Minister, replied, "This question of an inquiry into the Malabar Rising is now before the House for the third time. I do not see any use in perpetually forcing the subject before the Assembly. Sir, I feel any inquiry such as is now proposed would merely revive bitter memories and stir up resentment." Mr. Mahmood Shamnar Sahib Bahadur counters the Home Minister thus, "There is no doubt that an inquiry is very necessary to inquire into the causes of these outbreaks. I do not agree with him when he says that no inquiry is necessary at all." Mr. Muhammad Yamin Khan retorted, "My honourable friend from Madras has in the House today laid the whole of the blame on a certain section of the community only. When such a kind of feeling exists, I do not think that this matter should be left as it is one-sided. If what the government have been telling the public is really trustworthy, then it is in their own interest that this committee should be appointed and an independent inquiry should be made. Nobody can then say that the accounts that have been appearing were only government accounts." Despite the coherent arguments to appoint an inquiry to look into the causes of the Mappila Uprising of 1921, the motion was negatived. An independent inquiry, as demanded by the Muslim legislators, would have conclusively pinned the responsibility of the riots and established the fact, or otherwise, of Mappila atrocities against Hindus. In the absence of such a report, one is compelled to turn to other sources to answer the question. Some incontrovertible facts gleaned from official records, newspaper columns, and the views of research scholars in the field are presented herewith. Involvement of Hindus in the revolt and the nature of attacks on Hindu landlords. There is evidence to show that several Hindu names appear in the list of rebels compiled by Hitchcock, the then police commissioner of Malabar. Further, official sources have recorded that in the attacks on the police stations at Mamarakad and Perin Talamanna, Hindus had also taken an active part. Based on the criminal appeal cases for the year 1922, 23 and 24, Panika points out that of the 195 cases of plunder referred to the Madras High Court, 28 were deserted houses and 8 were accompanied by murder. In 159 cases, no one was injured. Shows that of the murdered, 4 were landlords and 4 cultivators, the former consisting of 3 Nayars, 1 Ambudri, and the latter of 2 Nayars, 1 Tiya and 1 Mappila. Most of the 159 houses plundered without infliction of personal physical injury belonged to landlords and cultivators, at least 5 of whom were Mopulars themselves. The Kerala Chandrika, a newspaper of the 29th August 1921, notes that the report about the Mopulars looting Hindu houses is altogether unfounded. That absolute falsehood against Mohammedans are published in English-owned newspapers, and that the governments are accepting such reports. Two reports, one by a staunchly Hindu paper, Bande Matram, and another by a Muslim newspaper, Zamindar, reflect the general feeling of distrust of official reports among the influential Indian papers of the time. Bande Matram wrote, "But the official versions of the Malabar incidents are full of mischief and malice." Zamindar reported, "The correspondents of Anglo-Indian and moderate papers are publishing long stories of Mopular atrocities. But the reader should not believe these statements, as they are not supported by any proof. Section 153A has become paralyzed against those who publish baseless and vile statements intended to sow feelings of enmity between the Hindus and the Mohammedans." Simon James, by the way, faculty member of the Nihon University, Japan, points to what he believes is the main source of the misinformation concerning the alleged victimization of Hindus in an article he published in the Journal of International Studies titled "The Mopular Rebellion Reconsidered, Islamic Insurrection in Southern India, 1921 to 1922. He writes, "While the British forces certainly had a hard task, it was no doubt made easier by their suppression and distortion of the media. Government control of the media prevented all, except those involved in the highest levels of administration, from gaining a clear understanding of the events. Thus, from the very start, daily reports were peppered with stories of forced conversions, desecration of Hindu temples, rape and looting, many of which were subsequently found to be inaccurate or deliberately false. Furthermore, incidents such as the Melmuri raid on 25th October 1921 or the execution of 15 Mopulars, quote-unquote, by mistake in Kuzimanne on 16th November 1921 were suppressed." This indictment of the British policy of pitting Hindus against the Muslims and vice versa, so as to divide them and prevent any united opposition to British rule in India, was not unique to Malabar. It was widespread, if we are to believe the authors below. Stanford scholar Audrey Tashke, author of an epoch-making book on Aurangzeb, the much maligned Mughal emperor, and Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal court, says, "The British benefited from pitting Hindus and Muslims against one another and portrayed themselves as neutral saviors who could keep ancient religious conflicts at bay." She also makes a pertinent observation of contemporary Hindu right-wing propaganda. She says, "While colonialism ended in the 1940s, the modern Hindu right has found tremendous political value in continuing to proclaim and create endemic Hindu-Muslim conflict." In a video interview speaking on the launch of the Anarchy, William Dalrymple admits that the British certainly exacerbated the communal divide in India. Let's now move to Mopular leaders and their treatment of Hindus during the riots. The following will establish how the main Mopular leadership went out of their way to protect Hindus and their properties. These facts certainly run counter to the narrative that blames the Mopulars for being anti-Hindu. The leaders were opposed to forcible conversion. Both Ali Musliar and A.K. Haji exerted their influence to prevent it. So did Chambaraseri Tangal and Siti Koya Tangal. Despite their religiosity and limited political experience, they tried to disassociate religious considerations from their public conduct. Ali Musliar made arrangements to guard the property of Hindu landlords and, as a consequence, till his arrest on 31st August 1921, Rich Hindu families in the Tirungadi area were protected against plunder. V.K. Haji exerted himself even more vigorously in this direction. In a proclamation issued in Manjeri on 24th August 1921, he assured safety and protection to the Hindus. He tried to win their confidence by arranging to return the jewelry plundered from the Nambudri Bank at Manjeri. He also tried to prevent plunder and went around to punish the guilty. V.K. Haji sent this historic letter to the reputed paper The Hindu, which appeared in the newspaper on October 18, 1921. He wrote, "Honored editor, I request you to publish the following facts in your paper. According to the press reports from Malabar, which you will have got, Hindu-Muslim unity in Malabar has thoroughly ceased to exist. It appears that the report that Hindus are forcibly converted by my men is entirely untrue. Such conversions were done by the government party and reserve policemen in Mufti, mingling themselves with the rebels." V.K. Haji was an ardent advocate of Hindu-Muslim unity and vehemently opposed the targeting of Hindus by nefarious elements under the guise of the Khilafat movement. He issued clear instructions that no innocent Hindus should be targeted in the name of targeting the British. He styled himself Raja of the Hindus, Amir of the Mohammedans, and Colonel of the Khilafat army. Collaborators attacked irrespective of religious affiliation. Given the atrocities carried out by the police and the army, it was but expected that the Mapillas would treat all collaborators with the police and the army with the severity they deserved. In doing so, they did not show any leniency towards Mapillas either. The number of Mapillas punished for collaborating with the army and police was not small. The murder of prominent police inspector Khan Bahadur Chekutti, K. Veeran Haji of Nilambur, T. Kunnakutti of Vanyambalam, T. Moyuddin of Trikolam, K. Kunnikoya of Tirungadi, Itra Haji and T. Muhammad Kutti of Vandur, C. Pukarakutti of Cherambattur, as well as the reprisals against the Mapillas of Vandur, vividly illustrate the attitude of the Mapillas even against their own kind. Christians and Hindus who collaborated were similarly punished. The attacks were clearly not based on religion. The incident at Tuvur on 25th September 1921, which received enormous publicity and, in the words of Panikkar, is the most cited example of the rebels' ruthlessness, ferocity, and even of their fanatical spirit. The provocation clearly was a support given to the army by the villagers of Tuvur, both the Hindus and the Mapilla. When the army left, the rebels entered the village, rounded up 34 Hindus and 2 Mapillas, killed them and threw their bodies into a well. Even M.B. Nambudri Pat states that the massacre at Tuvur was because the rebels suspected that some people were working, quote-unquote, on the other side. Another piece of incontrovertible proof that the Mapillas did not harm those who did not harm them is a letter addressed to the same Hindu newspaper dated 27th August 1921 by one C. Karunakara Menon of Angadipuram, who says, "It should be said to the credit of the rioters that no case of violence to person has come to my knowledge. I have left my 16-year-old daughter and 3 sons at Angadipuram, testifying to my confidence that the rioters would do no harm to them." In concluding this episode, one can safely say a review of the literature on this subject reveals that the criticism leveled against the Mapillas for their alleged violence against Hindus is, in the main, a product of non-Muslim authors. Hindu members of the Congress were not free from this attitude. Even Gandhi, in Panikar's words, was no exception.